The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama Bin Laden.
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 Osama Bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive!
Osama bin Laden is one of the most notorious figures of the 21st century, known for his relentless obsession with attacking the United States and its allies. His mission was clear and unwavering, leading to catastrophic events like the 9/11 attacks and a global war on terror. But what exactly fueled this terrorist mastermind's fixation on the United States? What set him on a path of radicalism that ultimately ended with his death at the hands of SEAL Team 6 in 2011? In today's video, we will explore the origins of Osama bin Laden's radicalism, the geopolitical forces that shaped his ideology, and the events that led him to launch his initial attack against the U.S. The early years. A life of privilege. Osama bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, into a life of immense wealth and privilege. As the son of Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, a billionaire construction magnate, Osama was part of one of the most prominent families in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Laden was originally from Yemen, but rose to prominence in Saudi Arabia by securing lucrative construction contracts with the Saudi royal family. His company, the Saudi Bin Laden Group, became one of the largest construction firms in the Middle East, responsible for major projects such as the expansion of the holy sites in Mecca and Medina. Osama was born to Mohammed's 10th wife, Hamida al-Attas, and was one of 52 children. Despite the large family, Mohammed ensured that his children were well provided for, both financially and in terms of education. Osama's early years were spent in the lap of luxury, far removed from the struggles and hardships that many of his future followers would endure. His mother divorced Mohammed shortly after Osama's birth, but he still inherited a substantial fortune from his father, estimated to be at least $25 million. This financial security would later play a crucial role in funding his extremist activities. A religious upbringing. While the bin Laden family was wealthy and well integrated into Saudi society, they were also devoutly religious, adhering to a mainstream version of Sunni Islam. The Saudi kingdom, established by the Al Saud family in the 18th century, is known for its strict interpretation of Sunni Islam, particularly the Wahhabi doctrine, which advocates a return to what its followers see as the pure original form of Islam. This religious environment undoubtedly influenced Osama from a young age, instilling in him a deep sense of Islamic identity and duty. However, the bin Laden family's practice of Islam was not particularly radical, and there was little in Osama's early life to suggest that he would one day become one of the world's most infamous terrorists. Education and early interests. In the 1970s, Osama bin Laden attended King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, where he studied economics and business administration. He was described by his classmates as a quiet, serious student who was passionate about poetry, military history, and soccer. It's important to note that during this period there was no indication that Osama harbored any radical or anti-Western sentiments. On the contrary, he seemed poised to follow in his father's footsteps, perhaps to take over the family business or to become a successful businessman in his own right. However, King Abdulaziz University was also a hub of Islamic thought, and it was here that Osama was first exposed to more radical interpretations of Islam. One of his professors, Abdullah Azam, a Palestinian scholar and theologian, would later become known as one of the founding fathers of modern jihadism. Azam preached the importance of jihad, or holy war, particularly in defense of Muslim lands under attack by foreign invaders. This ideology would deeply influence Osama bin Laden, sowing the seeds of the radicalism that would later define his life. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a turning point. The The real turning point in Osama bin Laden's life came in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This event had a profound impact on the Muslim world, galvanizing many young Muslims to join the fight against what they saw as an atheistic superpower invading a Muslim country. For Osama, this was a call to arms. He left his comfortable life in Saudi Arabia and traveled to Afghanistan to join the Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters resisting the Soviet invasion. At this time, the United States and the Soviet Union were bitter enemies, locked in a Cold War struggle for global influence. The U.S. saw the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a critical threat to its interests in the region and began supporting the Mujahideen through covert operations. This support, part of the larger strategy known as the Reagan Doctrine, included providing the Mujahideen with weapons, training, and financial aid. Ironically, Osama bin Laden, who would later become the U.S.'s most wanted terrorist, was fighting on the same side as the Americans during this period. The birth of Al-Qaeda. During the Afghan-Soviet War, Osama bin Laden began to establish himself as a leader within the Mujahideen. He used his personal wealth to fund training camps, recruit fighters, and supply weapons. It was during this time that he founded Al-Qaeda, which means the base in Arabic. Originally, Al-Qaeda was not intended to be a terrorist organization, but rather a support network for the Mujahideen fighters. However, as the war dragged on and the Soviets were eventually forced to withdraw in 1989, Osama's views began to harden. He became increasingly radicalized, seeing the victory in Afghanistan as proof that Muslim warriors could defeat a superpower through jihad. After the Soviet withdrawal, Afghanistan descended into chaos, with various factions of the Mujahideen fighting for control. Osama returned to Saudi Arabia, where he was hailed as a hero for his role in the Afghan Jihad. However, the experience had profoundly changed him. He now believed that jihad was the only way to protect and expand Islam, and that the greatest threat to the Muslim world was not just external enemies like the Soviet Union, but also the internal corruption and hypocrisy of Muslim governments that aligned themselves with the West. The Gulf War and Osama's radicalization. The next major event that further radicalized Osama bin Laden was the Gulf War of 1990-1991, when Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, invaded Kuwait in August 1990. It sent shockwaves throughout the Middle East. The invasion was widely condemned, and a coalition of countries led by the United States launched Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait. Saudi Arabia, fearing that Saddam might invade their country next, invited U.S. troops to station on Saudi soil to protect the kingdom. This decision by the Saudi government was a pivotal moment in Osama bin Laden's radicalization. He viewed the presence of non-Muslim troops in the birthplace of Islam as a profound violation of Islamic principles. Although the U.S. forces were invited by the Saudi government and were far from the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, their presence was too close for Osama's comfort. He saw this as a humiliation for the Muslim world and a sign that the Saudi government had become a puppet of the West. In response, Osama offered to use his Mujahideen fighters to defend Saudi Arabia from Saddam's forces, but the Saudi government rejected his offer, opting instead for the more reliable and technologically advanced U.S. military. This rejection deeply offended Osama and solidified his view that the Saudi regime was corrupt and unworthy of ruling the Muslim Holy Lands. After the war, when the U.S. decided to maintain a military presence in Saudi Arabia to enforce the no-fly zones over Iraq, Osama's anger turned into outright hatred. He now saw the United States as the primary enemy of Islam and became determined to drive American forces out of the Muslim world. The formation of a global jihad. Following the Gulf War, Osama bin Laden's rhetoric became increasingly anti-American. In 1992, he was expelled from Saudi Arabia for his outspoken opposition to the Saudi government and its alliance with the U.S. He moved to Sudan, where he continued to build Al-Qaeda, transforming it from a support network for the Afghan Mujahideen into a global jihadist organization dedicated to attacking the enemies of Islam, with the United States at the top of the list. During his time in Sudan, Osama established training camps and expanded Al-Qaeda's operations, recruiting fighters from across the Muslim world. These recruits were trained in guerrilla warfare, bomb-making, and other terrorist tactics. It was also during this period that Osama began to form alliances with other extremist groups, laying the groundwork for a global jihadist network. Al-Qaeda's first major attacks were carried out in the mid-1990s, including the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City in 1993 and attacks on U.S. military personnel in Saudi Arabia. The 1996 Fatwa, a declaration of war. In 1996, Osama bin Laden issued his first fatwa, a religious edict declaring jihad against the United States. The fatwa, titled Declaration of War Against the Americans, occupying the land of the two holy places, called for Muslims to rise up and expel American forces from Saudi Arabia. This fatwa marked the beginning of Osama's public campaign against the United States and set the stage for the escalation of violence that would culminate in the 9/11 attacks. The fatwa cited several grievances against the United States, including its support for Israel, the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, and its sanctions against Iraq, which Osama claimed were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. He framed the conflict as a defensive jihad, arguing that it was the duty of all Muslims to defend their lands from foreign invaders. This fatwa was a clear signal that Osama had transitioned from being a regional jihadist leader to a global terrorist mastermind with the United States as his primary target. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a convenient justification. One of the reasons often cited by Osama bin Laden for his jihad against the United States was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In his public statements and videotaped messages, Osama frequently mentioned the plight of the Palestinian people and the U.S.'s unwavering support for Israel as a major justification for his actions. However, it is important to understand that this was not initially the primary motivation for Osama's war against the U.S. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of the most enduring and contentious issues in the Middle East, with deep historical roots and profound religious significance. For many Muslims, the conflict is seen as a symbol of Western imperialism and a direct attack on the Muslim world. The Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, located on the Temple Mount, is one of Islam's holiest sites, and the struggle over this site has fueled religious and political tensions for decades. However, Osama bin Laden did not publicly focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict until after the 9/11 attacks. Prior to that, his rhetoric was more focused on the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia and the suffering of Muslims in places like Iraq and Somalia. Some analysts believe that Osama began to emphasize the Israeli-Palestinian conflict later as a way to broaden his appeal and rally more support from the Muslim world, where the issue is deeply emotional and politically charged. The Gulf War and Iraq sanctions, a catalyst for hatred. Another significant factor in Osama bin Laden's radicalization was the Gulf War and the subsequent UN sanctions on Iraq. The Gulf War ended in 1991 with the liberation of Kuwait, but the aftermath of the war had lasting consequences. The UN imposed severe sanctions on Iraq in an effort to force Saddam Hussein to comply with international demands, including the destruction of weapons of mass destruction. These sanctions led to widespread suffering among the Iraqi population, with reports of malnutrition, disease, and a significant increase in child mortality. Osama bin Laden seized on the suffering of the Iraqi people as a major grievance against the United States. In his 1998 fatwa, he claimed that the sanctions had caused the deaths of over 1 million Iraqis, including hundreds of thousands of children. This narrative was used to justify attacks on American civilians, as Osama argued that the U.S. government was responsible for the suffering of Muslims in Iraq. However, it is important to note that Osama had no direct ties to Iraq, and Saddam Hussein's regime was secular and ideologically opposed to the type of Islamic fundamentalism that Osama espoused. The 9/11 attacks, a turning point. The September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were the culmination of Osama bin Laden's campaign against the United States. These attacks, carried out by 19 Al-Qaeda operatives, were the deadliest terrorist attacks in history, killing nearly 3,000 people and shocking the world. The attacks were a strategic masterstroke for Al-Qaeda, as they not only inflicted massive casualties but also provoked the U.S. into launching a global war on terror. In the aftermath of 9/11, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to dismantle Al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime that had provided Osama with sanctuary. However, Osama bin Laden managed to evade capture for nearly a decade, becoming a symbol of defiance against the West. During this time, Al-Qaeda continued to carry out terrorist attacks around the world, further spreading its radical ideology. The 9/11 attacks also had a profound impact on U.S. foreign policy, leading to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the establishment of a vast global counterterrorism infrastructure. The war in Iraq, in particular, created a power vacuum that allowed Al-Qaeda to expand its operations and establish a foothold in the country, leading to the rise of groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would later evolve into ISIS. The endgame, the hunt for bin Laden. For nearly a decade after the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden remained a fugitive, eluding capture despite being the most wanted man in the world. The U.S. intelligence community, along with its allies, launched an extensive manhunt, tracking Osama's movements across Pakistan and Afghanistan. The search for Osama was complicated by the fact that he was constantly on the move, living in remote areas and relying on a network of loyal supporters to evade detection. The breakthrough came in 2010 when U.S. intelligence located a courier linked to Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. After months of surveillance, the CIA concluded that Osama was hiding in a compound in Abbottabad, a town located just a few miles from Pakistan's military academy. On May 2, 2011, a team of Navy SEALs known as SEAL Team 6 launched a daring raid on the compound, killing Osama bin Laden and several of his associates. The death of Osama bin Laden was a significant victory for the United States and marked the end of a decade-long manhunt. The legacy of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden's death was a major blow to Al-Qaeda, but the organization did not disappear with his demise. Under the leadership of Ayman al-Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda continued to operate, though it was weakened by the loss of its charismatic leader. The rise of ISIS in the years following Osama's death also overshadowed Al-Qaeda, as ISIS became the new face of global jihadism. However, Osama's legacy lives on in the form of the global jihadist movement he helped to inspire. His actions and ideology have left a lasting impact on the world, influencing a generation of extremists and shaping the course of global terrorism. The war on terror, which was launched in response to his attacks, continues to this day, with the U.S. and its allies engaged in a long and complex struggle against various jihadist groups around the world. The impact on U.S. foreign policy and global relations. The actions of Osama bin Laden and the subsequent global war on terror have had far-reaching implications for U.S. foreign policy and international relations. The invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, followed by the Iraq War in 2003, marked a significant shift in U.S. military strategy, with a focus on preemptive strikes and counterterrorism. These wars, particularly the Iraq War, were highly controversial and led to significant loss of life, both military and civilian, as well as the destabilization of entire regions. The war on terror also led to changes in how the U.S. and its allies approached issues of national security, surveillance, and civil liberties. The introduction of the USA Patriot Act, increased airport security measures, and enhanced intelligence sharing between countries were all direct responses to the threat posed by Al-Qaeda. However, these measures also sparked debates about privacy, human rights, and the balance between security and freedom. Globally, Osama bin Laden's actions and the U.S. response have influenced the rise of other extremist groups. Al-Qaeda's ideology inspired similar organizations across the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, leading to a proliferation of jihadist movements. Groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines have all drawn inspiration from Al-Qaeda, creating new challenges for global security. The role of ideology in bin Laden's actions. It is crucial to understand that Osama bin Laden's actions were not driven solely by political grievances, but were deeply rooted in a specific ideological framework. Bin Laden adhered to a radical interpretation of Salafi jihadism, a movement within Sunni Islam that advocates for the establishment of an Islamic state governed by a strict interpretation of Sharia law. Salafi jihadists believe in the necessity of armed struggle, or jihad, against both non-Muslims and Muslims who do not adhere to their strict interpretation of Islam. This ideology was central to Osama bin Laden's worldview and provided the justification for his attacks on the United States and its allies. He believed that the Muslim world was under siege by Western powers, particularly the U.S., and that it was the duty of all Muslims to defend Islam through jihad. This belief system was reinforced by the teachings of scholars like Abdullah Azzam, and influenced by the writings of Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian intellectual whose works laid the foundation for modern Islamist movements. The evolution of Al-Qaeda post-Bin Laden. Since Osama bin Laden's death, Al-Qaeda has undergone significant changes. Under the leadership of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the organization has decentralized, with regional affiliates gaining more autonomy. This shift has allowed Al-Qaeda to survive despite the loss of its leader and the sustained pressure from U.S. and allied forces. Affiliates like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, and Al-Shabaab have continued to carry out attacks, often focusing on local and regional targets rather than the large-scale international attacks that characterized Osama's leadership. The rise of ISIS also forced Al-Qaeda to adapt. While ISIS initially emerged as an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it quickly grew into a rival, challenging Al-Qaeda's dominance in the global jihadist movement. The competition between the two groups has led to a divergence in strategy and tactics, with ISIS focusing on establishing a territorial caliphate, while Al-Qaeda has continued to operate as a decentralized network. Despite these challenges, Al-Qaeda remains a significant threat, particularly in regions like Africa and the Middle East. The future of global terrorism. As we look to the future, the legacy of Osama bin Laden and the global war on terror will continue to shape the landscape of international security. The threat of terrorism has evolved, with lone wolf attacks, cyber terrorism, and the use of emerging technologies becoming new challenges for governments and security agencies. The rise of right-wing extremism and other forms of domestic terrorism also highlights the need for a comprehensive approach to countering violent extremism in all its forms. Conclusion. Osama bin Laden's journey from a wealthy Saudi businessman to the world's most wanted terrorist is a complex and troubling story. His radicalization was shaped by a combination of personal experiences, geopolitical events, and ideological influences. While his motivations were multifaceted, the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War was likely the most significant factor in his turn towards anti-Americanism. His ability to rally support for his cause through a combination of religious rhetoric, political grievances, and moral criticism made him a uniquely dangerous figure. As we look back on the life and legacy of Osama bin Laden, it is important to understand the factors that led him down this dark path. His story serves as a reminder of the dangers of extremism and the complex interplay of religion, politics, and ideology in the modern world. If you want to learn more about Osama bin Laden's beginnings, check out our video on how the CIA funded a terrorist organization, or watch our breakdown of how SEAL Team 6 tracked down Osama bin Laden minute by minute. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis of the most important events and figures in history.